looked good, but I don't know much about this Kluber guy. I know Felix, I know King Felix or whatever. So that could be, and we'll have to see. That'll be part of the equation. That's tomorrow night, and nowhere near as hopeful, but I expect finished in the top 5. Michael Brantley up for the MVP here coming up as well. That one's Thursday, I believe, 6 o'clock. They announced that one, but it would just be happy if he represents. Clearly, team performance plays a big part in who wins the MVP. Hey, let's look away from award season, because while that's all fun and well, and those are the final pieces and vestiges of 2014, the Indians are already knee-deep in the work for next year. At least they better be. And if they're not, that's a different issue. But knee-deep into that right now. You and I were talking, and I know in the last week you've worked on putting together a list of free agent targets, and I think you were shooting for realistic free agent targets and ways that you thought the Indians would go about this process of fixing their team. So you want to do that, or are you going to hold out? If you want, we don't have to do that. We can play tiddlywinks or anything else. But if you got a list, I'm up for hearing it, man.
All right, let's do it. I think first of all, you have to realize how much, or should I say how little, the Indians have to spend. They probably only have around $10 million or so to spend, and that's kind of tough because if you want to get a pitcher, you want to get a hitter, and then if you want to get one of each, then neither one might not have that big of an impact. So I think that what the Indians need to do is pretty much splurge as much as they can and get that one big guy, and then maybe fill in with somebody else. And the strategy that I've identified here is for the Indians. My first 2 picks are hitters, and then the next 3 guys are pitchers who might actually end up being a little more expensive anyway. So I really like to focus on the 2 hitters that I think could really help the Indians. And the first one is Billy Butler. Strangely enough, Butler was pretty much let go by the Royals after the World Series because, he had a club option and it was for like $13.5 million. And that was just way too much based on Butler's production. So he's going to go somewhere for a lot less than that. But, he is by no means washed up. He's been very, he's been very good over the years for the Royals. Last year, a little bit of a down year. He hit 271. He had 9 homers, but he still had 66 RBI, which was very good. He's almost always giving you double-digit home runs, and he had 29 home runs as recently as 2012. Now, this would seem like the dream scenario for the Indians, since they always like to try to pick somebody up on the cheap after kind of a down year like they did with David Murphy. So I think that Butler would really be a good pickup if they can afford him, especially since even though the Royals gave him up, it would almost be like a direct steal from the Royals. That would really be nice.
I hear you there. My one issue, and it's the same thing that people throw back at me when I say Victor Martinez, is you're talking about a guy who is a designated hitter by trade / occasional first baseman. And again, like people say with Victor, who doesn't play? I'm with you there, but I think that would probably have to, and I think anything that you're talking about here is cognizant of the fact that there's going to have to be some type of trade. I'm not saying you sell the farm, I'm not saying it has to be the biggest trade either, but I think we know that they have to shuffle the deck a bit as far as some of these pieces that are impediments to adding to your team, and it can't be done just in free agency. But yeah, I hear you as far as the thought process of hurting the other team, because as we've already seen, Kansas City has talked about still the possibility of bringing him back in 2015. They just had to get out from underneath that option. So, you got a guy who's a lifetime 300 hitter in 8 years, as you said, a down year this year, down in the power numbers as well. He peaked out a couple of years ago, 2012, that All-Star season. He had 107 RBIs, 29 home runs, but the last 2 years, the power has dropped. Still 15 home runs last year, which aren't terrible power numbers, but then dropped down to 9 here this year. I do think the value could be there, but you're going to have that issue of too much of a logjam in one place. You got a lot of people who remember that was a story in the World Series, is you got this big cog of your team and you can't use them in half of the World Series. So
I think what you have to look at is where should the Indians get somebody. Of course, you've got Brantley and you've got Bourne, who are established in left and center. You've got Santana, who's pretty much set in there at first. So you're pretty much looking at like the right field DH type of situation. Of course, you've got Swisher, who, we all know about him. And of course, Murphy might end up having to be traded. He might be the guy, pretty much like Drew Stubbs. If he had a fantastic year and hit 25 home runs, then great. But he didn't, and we need somebody else who can do that, so it might be time to ship him out and try somebody else. So I could see them bringing in Butler, giving him some time at first, some time at DH. I don't want to put Swisher in the outfield. Of course, you still have Ryan Rayburn to play some in the outfield. So if anybody can, shuffle him in there enough, it would certainly be Terry Francona, but he's kind of my top pick. But my other top pick...
Real quick, Jeff, let me ask you a question.
Yeah?
Do you see, because Mike Brandenberry and I were doing this a couple of weeks ago, and it just kind of, both of us looked and said, where we could see that guy going besides Cleveland? And I think Billy Butler may fit into that too. If you see a team like Detroit and they lose Victor, that could be the type of piece that you plug in there perhaps to replace that, because there's a guy in a similar position there. I don't know, what are your thoughts? But I could see I could see that being a possible fallback guy for the Tigers should they indeed lose Victor Martinez.
I could see that too. I wouldn't want to see that because I think Butler's a very good hitter, and I'd love to see him with the Indians. But yeah, I could see the Tigers poaching him too. So it may be a little bit of a bidding war, but pretty much all within the same division. Who knows? Maybe the White Sox might want to jump in on that too. Hopefully not.
All right. Well, you said you had a second piece here, so go ahead with it.
Yeah, my second pick would be Michael Morse, the outfielder for the Giants. Of course, we also saw him in the World Series. A good right-handed power hitter. I just think he would give us a little more power out of right field. You could just plug him in there. He had 279 last year with 16 homers, 61 RBI. He also, came up big in the World Series. He was, the DH when they were in Kansas City, and he came up with 4 RBI in the World Series. Of course, he's got that World Series experience. He might be the kind of good veteran hitter that can help the team get over the top, both from a leadership standpoint and from a production standpoint. I think he might end up giving the Tribe the power in right field that I think they kind of lacked last year out of Murphy and Rayburn.
And I hear that. That's an interesting thought process there. What kind of money do you think he's looking for? What kind of deal do you think Morse is looking for here?
Well, I've heard that he's going to be about 2 years, $20 million. And that might take up pretty much the entire about $10 million budget that the Indians have to spend. But if you want to bring in somebody who's an impact bat when you're already, clogged up with the contracts you have, especially with Bourne and Swisher, he might be pretty much the most that you could shoehorn into the budget. But, that's what you got to do. You got to get somebody. That was the big problem in a lot of ways. And if that's the case, that means you're pretty much going to have to double down on your nice, young, cheap pitching staff, and you won't really be able to help that pitching staff very much unless you trade Murphy for a veteran starting pitcher. So you're pretty much committing all your free agent dollars to hitting, which might be a risk that the Indians might kind of have to take.
Yeah, and you can understand that because they feel that the well is full, not just with the the main group of guys that we've talked about, but with some of the guys coming up from the farm system as well. They believe that they've got 5, 6, 7 different candidates here. But you know what? Though I will just go back to what Mike says, and something that we may say again in February is that is the same type of logic. What you just said is the same type of logic that the Indians went with and that Indians fans allowed themselves to go with going into spring training last year. Well, we got all this pitching, and we got this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, and this guy. Well, we did, but we didn't have the guys that we thought we did. Some of them fell into place. Some of them came later. Some of them eventually figured it out, and some of them came from out of nowhere. And we did have all the pieces, but we didn't have them all together until we got down to the second half and really stabilized that rotation down the second half of the season. So that's the scary part about that. You hope that the second half and what we saw is you go, okay, they can bank on this there, but I do think there's got to be a veteran, and it may come in trade. It may come in trade for sure. But I think there's got to be a veteran pitcher in there as well. You've got to have some protection built in. And who knows, man? I mean, we keep hearing it enough. The Indians are definitely the kind of team that can talk themselves into bringing back Justin Masterson on a make good. You know they can, and I can totally see maybe just one of those, well, no, I can't see him coming in for I don't know. Maybe one of those, see what happens in spring training. I think he gets a better deal, though, from somebody. Somebody will give him a decent deal. I know you're saying, why? How would you? Trust me, somebody's going to give him some money. It may not be the money that he would have got here in Cleveland, but somebody's going to give Masterson some money. But he would fit into that kind of reclamation deal that the Tribe likes to do. So who knows? Who else you got?
Well, there's a few honorable mentions, guys who would come cheaper, guys that I'm not really that excited about. But if we got one of these guys, maybe we might be able to afford one of the three pitchers that I have here. I'm talking about guys like Ryan Ludwig. Although I'm not thrilled with Ludwig because, that would mean that we had him before his prime and after his prime, but not during his prime. That would be kind of bothersome. Then you've got Alex Rios, Torrey, and then Kendrick Morales. Maybe one of those guys might be a little cheaper, but I don't think they would help you as much as Billy Butler and Michael Morse did, but maybe you can afford one of the pitchers.
See, to me, I think the Indians have a lot of guys that maybe can help you. What if? I think that anything that they do needs to be needle move off season here. I really do. I think you got a lot of guys. Hell, rather than give those at bats, Jesus Aguilar. And I don't want to do that. What I'm saying is, once we start going that route, I got some young, intriguing power guys that I want to take a look at too, and maybe they won't start out as hot, but I think they'll finish hotter because you'll probably break down by the time we get to the end of the season. But yeah, I think the target's got to be one or two needle movers, man, and I think one of those comes in a trade, and the other one comes. I do agree with what you said as far as they are going to have somewhere between $10 and $15 million to work with. That's going to be their budget here for the winter unless they add more to it. That's just saying, hey, this is last year's payroll and we're going to match it. If we're going to match it, then you got 10, 12, at most $15 million to work with. I agree with you. I think they spend a lot of it in one chunk. That's where I think $10 million is probably a good estimate, somewhere in there. If it's whether it's for a hitter or a pitcher, and then they address the other in a trade. And like I said, there's a lot of possibilities because everybody says, I wish you could trade Swisher. And well, you can't do that. But there are a lot of intriguing possibilities of guys they could trade and things you could do. And the thing people got to keep in mind before the Indians do perhaps make one of these deals is you do have to give up stuff to get stuff. And I understand that. If you want to go get, and I'm just throwing a name, David Price. I'm just throwing that out there because it's a name people talk about.
Right.
You got to give up. You got to give up Lindor or Santana. Whatever. You're going to have to give up a piece. And I'd be cool with that for the right piece to come back. If they can sign a decent a free agent and make a trade for a second one and kind of bring in a 1-2 combination, maybe not A level, but B+ level guys, I think that might be enough to put them there and at least have them in there with Kansas City and Detroit for this season because all three teams, both Kansas City and Detroit, are taking some shots across, defections of their own. They're going to obviously reload as well, but it's going to be right there for these three teams to go to work. And I agree with you, Ron. I want to see him hit it a bit. He's got work. He's a young guy, but he's got that power. You can't buy it. Well, you can buy it. For the most part, it's a very real, but I like Aguilar, and I think he's got natural power, so I'd like to see him Moncrief. I know people are like, I know he's a project and he may never see the majors, but I'm telling you, he may, if nothing else, he'll be that guy that hits some mythical spring training home runs before his career's over. All right, Jeff Gorman. Tell you what, since we were talking about trades being the other thing, how about you and I next week talk about some trade possibilities, some things that are in the fire. It's hot stove league time, and talk about perhaps some people that the Indians may be interested in moving and what perhaps they could get in return.
That sounds like a good plan. Of course, it's got to be just the right mix. Of course, the Indians don't have a whole lot of wiggle room. They have to make every move count. The other pitchers I was going to mention were Edinson Volquez, Jason Hamill, and Ryan Vogelsong. But those guys will all be about $10 million, so it's going to be tough to fit those guys in there. But, and they cook about possible trade scenarios, who you keep and who might have some value, who other teams might be looking at and saying, hey, that guy might be pretty good and argue for.
Absolutely, because I definitely, I've said it all along, that's what the Indians do best, this front office, at acquiring talent. It's not in free agency. They're terrible in free agency. It's in the trade market. In the trade market, they I don't know why they couldn't identify people in their own draft for the last 10 years. They can now, but they can sure identify people that other teams have drafted and go